The year is 922. The Volga River, Russia. Ahmad ibn Fadlan has seen many things in his years of diplomatic travel for the Abbasid Caliphate. He has seen the courts of kings, the markets of Constantinople, the steppes of Central Asia stretching to every horizon. He has never seen anything like this. A Norse chieftain has died, and what Ibn Fadlan is witnessing, what he is writing down in the precise Arabic of a trained scholar, is the funeral. He writes for 10 days, 10 days of observation, 10 days of documentation, ritual after ritual, object after object placed in the ship. Preparations he does not fully understand but records with the attention of a man who senses he is watching something that needs preservation. And then the final day. The day when everything converges into a single act that he will describe as the most overwhelming thing witnessed. The ship burns. And what burns with it represents something about what the Norse believed about death that no academic analysis has communicated. Ibn Fadlan writes that he asked his Norse interpreter what the burning meant. What happened to the chieftain in the fire? The interpreter translated his question. One of them, an elderly Norse man, turned and looked at Ibn Fadlan and said something that Ibn Fadlan records verbatim. Something that has haunted the scholarship of Viking Age religion ever since. You Arabs are fools. You take your most beloved dead and put them in the cold ground where the worms consume them slowly. We take our beloved dead and in moments, in the time it takes to walk across a field, we send them to paradise. Ibn Fadlan did not have an answer. He wrote the exchange down and kept watching the fire. To understand Viking burial, you need to understand what the Norse believed happened after death. Not in the simplified version, not in the popular mythology version, in the version that the actual theological system describes. Because Norse afterlife beliefs were not simple. They were not a single destination. They were a map, a complex, destination-specific, manner-of-death-dependent map of what happened to different kinds of people when they died. Valhalla first. The Hall of Odin, the destination of warriors who died in battle with weapons in their hands, the most celebrated afterlife destination in the Norse system, the one the sagas glorify, the one the berserkers train toward. In Valhalla, the honored dead, the Einherjar, fought each day and feasted each night, preparing for Ragnarok. But Valhalla was not the only destination. Folkvanger, the field of Freya, an equally honorable destination for battle dead. The sagas suggest Freya claimed first choice of the fallen before Odin took the rest. Hell, the realm of the dead who did not die in battle. Not a punishment, not the Christian hell that the word now implies. A continuation, gray, diminished, separated from the glory of combat death destinations. But a continuation nonetheless. Ran, the goddess of the sea. Those who drowned, a significant category in a maritime culture, went to Ran's hall beneath the waves, Nastrond. The punishment destination. Within hell, a shore reserved for oath-breakers, murderers, and others whose crimes demanded consequence. The idea that some of the dead remained close to their burial mounds, present in the world in some form. Accessible to their descendants through specific ritual practices. The ancestor who was not entirely gone. Who could be consulted, appeased, asked for guidance, who lived on in the mound on the family's land. This belief shaped the physical form of Norse burial as profoundly as the Valhalla theology shaped the ship funerals. If the dead remained present in their burial mound, then what you buried with the dead mattered enormously. In 1880, a farmer in Vestfold, Norway, noticed something about the mound on his property. It was too regular to be natural. He had always known it was there. Everyone in the valley had always known it was there. But it was just a hill, a grass-covered rise in the landscape that had been there longer than anyone could remember. He began to dig. What emerged from that mound is now in the Viking ship museum in Oslo. The Gokstad ship, a Viking-age longship buried complete, 23 meters long, built from oak, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the blue clay that had sealed it for approximately 1,000 years. Inside the ship, the burial of a man, a chieftain, someone of significant rank, surrounded by the equipment of his life. Horses, dogs, peacocks, from somewhere in the Mediterranean or further east. Equipment for sailing, equipment for hunting, equipment for feasting. Everything he would need for what came next. The Gokstad ship was extraordinary. The Oseberg ship, found in 1904 in another Vestfold mound, was more extraordinary still. A ship buried around 834 AD. 2 women interred inside it, both of high status, both surrounded by the most remarkable collection of Viking Age objects ever recovered from a single excavation. 4 sledges, 3 ornate wooden beds, a wagon, the only complete Viking Age wagon ever found, kitchen equipment, textiles, buckets, animal sacrifices, plant materials prepared as food, and the ship itself, carved, decorated, ornamented. Woodwork of such sophistication that modern craftspeople have spent careers studying it and cannot fully replicate the techniques. The Oseberg ship was not a working vessel. It was built to be buried, built as a funeral object, as the vehicle that would carry 2 women to whatever came next. But the ship burials were only one form of Norse burial, and not even the most common. The most common Norse burial was the mound that lasted, the mound that was visible, the mound that sat on the family land for generations, a physical marker of the honored dead, a place where the living could come to maintain the relationship that death had not fully severed. Ibn Fadlan's account of the Volga Norse funeral is the most detailed eyewitness description of a Viking Age burial ever recorded. It deserves to be read in full. We cannot reproduce it here in its entirety. It runs to several thousand words of dense documentation, but the shape of what he describes can be followed. The chieftain died. He was placed in a temporary grave, a cold storage essentially, while preparations were made. The preparations took 10 days. A ship was brought ashore. A structure was built on the ship's deck, a pavilion of sorts, draped in fabric, furnished with objects from the dead man's life. Each day more objects were brought, his weapons, his armor, his tools, food and drink, sufficient for the journey, the Norse told Ibn Fadlan, though they did not specify how far the journey was. Animals were sacrificed, horses, dogs, a rooster and a hen, their bodies placed in the ship around the dead chieftain. On the final day, a woman died. She died voluntarily. This is the element of Ibn Fadlan's account that modern readers find most difficult to engage with. A slave woman volunteered to accompany him in death. The sagas describe this practice. The archaeological record contains evidence of it. It was real. The woman whom Ibn Fadlan describes speaking with through interpreters went through a specific ritual process over the final days of preparation. She visited each of the men in the Norse encampment. Each one said to her, "Tell your master that I did this for love of him." Love of him. The funeral was not just a disposal of the dead. It was a community statement, a collective act. On the final day, the dead chieftain was brought from his temporary grave and placed in the structure on the ship. The woman joined him. The ship was set alight. Ibn Fadlan describes the fire taking hold quickly, the wind off the river feeding it, the ship burning completely in approximately an hour. He describes standing on the shore watching. The interpreter said, "The wind is a gift from their God. It carries them quickly to paradise. If the wind were slow, it would be a sign of disfavor. The wind was fast, the fire burned quickly. The ship was gone. And above the site of the burning, within a short time, the Norse built a mound, a round mound of earth marked with a post. The dead man's name was carved in runes. Ibn Fadlan stood before it when it was finished. He wrote that he had felt something he could not name precisely in Arabic, something close to envy. Envy of a relationship with death, a framework for understanding and accepting and even celebrating the ending of a life. He wrote it down, and then he left, and the mound remained. Now here is what most accounts leave out. The financial cost. A genuine ship burial represented an investment of an entire farm's output. They did it because the theology demanded it, because what you sent with the dead was not optional. An improperly buried ancestor was a practical danger. The Norse believed the dead who were not properly honored could return, as Draugr, the restless dead, the improperly buried who came back hungry, who walked the land and made both worlds worse. The investment in proper burial was not generosity, it was insurance, against what came back if you got it wrong. Here is what the burial archaeology tells us that the saga accounts do not. The ship burials we find, the Oseberg, the Gokstad, the Township, the great mound burials of Vendel and Valsgerde, and the other elite sites, represent a tiny fraction of Norse burial practice, a fraction of a fraction. The overwhelming majority of Norse people were not buried in ships. They were cremated. Their ashes mixed with the ashes of objects burned with them, weapons, animals, tools, and deposited in a small pit or simple mound, sometimes marked, sometimes not, sometimes with objects of significant value, sometimes with almost nothing. The Norse burial system was not egalitarian. What you received in death reflected, or barely approximated, what you had possessed in life. A wealthy jarl received a ship, a successful farmer received a horse, a thrall received a shallow grave, if they received anything at all. The archaeology of Norse burial includes evidence of people interred with no objects, no animals, no boat, no weapons, no food, just a body. The theological questions this raises: where did these people go in the Norse framework, without the objects, without the ship, without the equipment for the journey, without the sacrifice, without any of the ritual investment that the theological system seemed to require? The sagas do not fully answer this, because the sagas were written by and for the people who could afford ships. The people who were buried with nothing left no sagas. They left bones, and the bones tell a story that the sagas do not. A story of a much larger, much more ordinary, much more economically constrained Norse world than the ship burial tradition suggests. A world where most people faced death not with a burning longship and 10 days of ritual and the collective participation of a community, but alone, or nearly alone, with whatever their family could afford, which was sometimes very little. The dark twist of Viking burial is not the sacrifice. The dark twist is the inequality, the same inequality that structured every other aspect of Norse life, the hierarchy of Jarl and Carl and Thrall, of wealthy and poor, of those whose names went into sagas and those whose names went into the ground and were lost. That inequality followed the Norse into death and determined what waited for them on the other side, or so they believed. In the summer of 2018, archaeologists working at a site in Gamla Uppsala, Sweden, made a discovery. Gamla Uppsala was the ancient religious center of the Norse world, the site of a great temple described as the holiest place in Scandinavia. They found a boat grave, not a large ship but a rowing boat buried with its occupant between the 5th and 7th centuries AD. Inside the boat, a warrior, full weapons, a sword, a shield, an arrow quiver, a comb, a game piece, and a horse, and a dog, everything needed. The warrior had been given everything the theology required. The archaeologists were careful and methodical. They documented everything, took samples, and ran the analyses. When the results came back from the ancient DNA analysis, they found something unexpected. The warrior was not what the weapons suggested. The genetic profile pointed toward origins in Eastern Europe or further east, along the trade routes that connected the Norse world. Someone who had traveled to Gamla Uppsala. Someone who had lived long enough in the Norse world to be buried in the Norse way. Someone whose community considered them worth the investment, worth the boat, worth the horse, worth the weapons, worth the ritual. We do not know where they came from originally or what gods they had believed in before they arrived in the Norse world. We know they were buried as one of the Norse. We know someone loved them enough to do it right. Think about Ibn Fadlan, standing on the banks of the Volga River in 922, watching the ship burn, feeling something he could not name in Arabic, something close to envy, not of the dead, of the living. A community that had built around the fact of death and engagement with it. A direct, expensive, communally witnessed engagement. The Norse did not pretend that death was not real. They built their theology, their destinations, and their warrior culture around it. They believed that what you did at the end, the investment, the objects you sent, the ritual you performed, mattered. That death was not the end of the relationship, it was a transition in it. And transitions required ceremony and witness, something between grief and wonder, something that had no clean name in Arabic or in English. Anyone who has ever stood at a grave and felt the inadequacy of words understands. The Norse understood it too. They just spent more money on it and burned the boat, because some things deserve to go out like that, not slowly, not quietly, not alone in the cold ground while the world moves on, but in fire, on the water, with everyone watching, with the wind behind it, carrying it quickly to wherever it was going.